Shovel Knight is perhaps one of the best examples of a retro indie game, as it intentionally tries to emulate the spirit of 2D NES platformers from back in the day. While the game has garnered a lot of success during its almost 7-year dev cycle, the company went through quite a lot of internal struggles to provide players with a ton of free updates that were essentially completely new games in their own right. One of those problems was money, despite the incredibly successful Kickstarter that unlocked every single stretch goal. Before taking a closer look at Shovel Knight's development, let's first talk about the people behind the game and how they formed Yacht Club Games. The original members of the indie studio all previously worked at another independent studio called WayForward, who you might know from games like the Shantae series, Contra 4, A Boy and His Blob, DuckTales Remastered, and a lot of other licensed games. It's a rather large company that works on multiple projects at the same time, and every project is assigned to a different set of developers. The team that worked on Double Dragon Neon, which was released in 2012, became close friends during its development, and they all felt like they had perfect chemistry together. Therefore, the developers wanted to explore what other kinds of games they could create next. Unfortunately, WayForward told them it wasn't possible to keep their team together and that they would have to split up for future projects. However, the developers had so much faith in their synergy as a team that they decided to leave WayForward and start their own company. Before there was ever the idea for Shovel Knight, the team knew they wanted to make something that adopted a simpler style of gameplay, much like the classic NES games from the 80s. Shovel Knight was always conceived of as an 8-bit game. Even before there was a shovel, we knew that we wanted to make a game that allowed the gameplay to naturally grow, born out of a few core mechanics. Harkening back to a time when that was how all games were made was an obvious choice. Additionally, that meant that we could create more content faster. When an enemy or object only has a few frames, iteration turnaround time is greatly reduced. This allowed us to focus on what matters most, the gameplay and experience of the player. In January 2013, the team was brainstorming about what kind of mechanics to implement in their 8-bit game, which at this point didn't feature the Shovel Knight protagonist yet. They brought up the down thrust from Zelda 2, one of their personal favorites. The devs started to imagine hitting enemies from above, and how you would then also dig through blocks on the ground. Perhaps you could even flip enemies over to hit their underbellies. That type of motion didn't quite fit with a sword-wielding knight though, and eventually one of the developers jokingly suggested letting the knight wield a shovel instead. I guess if he's a shovel guy, then he's like Plummet Knight, or maybe he's Shovel Knight, the shoveling knight. And just like that, Shovel Knight was born. The team quickly got to work in director Sean Velasco's crammed apartment and started preparing for a Kickstarter campaign. They divided their time between building a strong proof of concept that included a demo, as well as preparing everything for the Kickstarter itself. About 2 months later, Yacht Club Games had built enough assets and launched their Kickstarter on March 17, 2013. Their minimum funding goal was set to $75,000, although the team knew they would have to compromise their vision if they didn't hit any stretch goals. It almost seemed like that was going to be the case, because halfway through the Kickstarter, they managed to raise $50,000. The team started getting nervous, especially since they were still hard at work finishing the demo that needed to be playable at that year's PAX. It was a very stressful time for the studio to say the least. It's very taxing on a team, especially as small as ours, to put everything on Kickstarter, to put it all on the line. It's very hard to find time to work on a game at all when you're doing Kickstarter. Even just the campaign and the stuff you have to do afterwards, like the physical rewards. The PAX Gaming Convention was slated to start 9 days after they launched the Kickstarter, so time was running out. Fortunately, the studio was able to finish the demo just in time for the big event, providing the opportunity for people to try out Shovel Knight at their booth. People were extremely positive about the NES-inspired platformer, and not just regular visitors, but also the press. The likes of Destructoid and Kotaku started writing articles about the game and its Kickstarter, generating valuable marketing when the indie studio needed it most. On top of that, other developers that had done successful Kickstarters before played the demo at PAX and gave some good advice. By far the most valuable advice was to distribute their demo to big YouTubers. Right after they came back from PAX, the studio started sending out demos to popular YouTubers like Game Grumps, and those videos combined accumulated millions and millions of views. Almost overnight, the Kickstarter became a huge success and started hitting stretch goals in quick succession. On the last day of the Kickstarter, Yacht Club was able to raise over $300,000, with almost 15,000 people backing the project. One of the studio's programmers, David D'Angelo, contributes some of the success to nostalgia and the lack of a new Mega Man game at the time. Everyone was saying, there will never be a Mega Man game again, I'm so sad. And then here we come storming in with this game that feels much like a Mega Man experience. He further said that nostalgia works well on Kickstarter because it's something people can immediately understand. They still make Mario and Rayman, but there's nothing new there. The idea of seeing a new IP where the character is the name of the game was a cool thing to see. Being able to draw on the feelings people had when they were 8 years old worked for the Kickstarter. The developers couldn't believe what had happened, although reality started to sink in quickly. All the positive reception was very uplifting to the team, but now they not only had to develop the base game, but also many extra modes on top, like New Game Plus, a challenge mode, a gender swap mode, a 4-player battle mode, 3 additional playable characters, and so on. Their original promise of a release in September 2013 was looking almost impossible to keep. Now that the studio had a lot more money to work with and a lot more content to implement as a result, they postponed the release date to early 2014. The team received a lot of emails asking why it was going to take so long, since the Kickstarter gave the impression that Shovel Knight was already far into development. But the director Sean explained most of the game just didn't exist yet, and that the Kickstarter trailer and the PAX demo was literally everything the team had developed up until that point. Once the funds from Kickstarter came through around May 2013, the developers decided to leave behind Sean's apartment for a real office space to properly continue development. The next couple of months, the studio mostly focused on finishing the base game and decided to worry about the stretch goal DLC later. As mentioned before, the devs took inspiration from Zelda 2, starting with the down thrust. Additionally, Shovel Knight's world has a village very similar to Zelda 2, where random passerby will chat up Shovel Knight. The team wanted their characters to just be as goofy and fun as the ones you'd find in the land of Hyrule. Fun fact, all the NPC characters looked like default horse-person sprites, while the studio was figuring out what the gameplay function of each NPC was. Another strong inspiration was Mega Man, and this is evidenced by the room-based themed stages and their bosses, as well as the title of the game being the name of the protagonist. The heavy use of items in the game is directly inspired by Castlevania, because the developers thought it was interesting how Castlevania doesn't force you to use the items, but they still play a major part in how you can tackle each scenario and enemy in the game. They wanted to replicate that feeling in Shovel Knight, and extend it even further by making the items useful in many ways, whether it be for platforming, enemies or bosses. The team has also stated that the world map was inspired by both Mario 3 and UN Squadron. Mario 3 remains in our minds when we recall what it's like to traverse a large NES world filled with surprises, while UN Squadron has more of a tiered map approach. That allows the player a choice in where they want to go while still escalating the challenge, without throwing the player into a completely flat stage structure. Some people speculated that the down thrust might have also been inspired by the DuckTales game, but the team has gone on record saying it was mostly just inspired by Zelda 2. However, they did mention that the feeling of discovering hidden treasure in Shovel Knight was certainly inspired by DuckTales. Mother 3 was also looked at for inspiration, specifically for the story. The team wanted to emotionally engage the player in some way like Mother 3 does. This led to the idea that Shovel Knight had to bury his wife at the end of the game with his shovel, but this was ultimately changed for a less melancholic ending. Interestingly enough, Shield Knight wasn't much of a character at the start of development and only existed to motivate Shovel Knight. She was apparently even nicknamed Princess MacGuffin for a while. There's also some Dark Souls in Shovel Knight, because the developers wanted to come up with a mechanic that places an important emphasis on player death, just like Dark Souls did. This led to the implementation of the checkpoint system, something that went through many changes to balance the difficulty. It first started as invisible checkpoints, much like the Mega Man games. However, they wanted to make it more physical, and they also didn't want to have too many checkpoints, since that would make the game too easy. Instead of turning down the amount of checkpoints though, the team instead decided to give players the choice of spending money to activate a checkpoint, adding even more value to the currency system in the game, while also providing more player agency. That iteration of the system was a problem for inexperienced players, however, since there was no guarantee that every player would be able to collect enough money to activate the checkpoints in the first place. Yacht Club didn't want the platformer to be too easy, but also not too difficult so that more people could enjoy playing it. The developers wanted to find a way to satisfy both experienced and inexperienced players. So, one day, they had the idea of giving players the option to eliminate a checkpoint in return for some extra gems, adding a risk-reward system to the checkpoint mechanic. The team wanted to stick to the NES aesthetics, and therefore potential limitations, as close as possible. It almost had to look like it would be possible to play Shovel Knight on an actual NES console, and this meant sticking to the limited 54 colors the NES was capable of producing, for example. However, in some cases, they did decide to break out of those limitations, when they couldn't find a compelling reason to keep them in the game, or if they would hamstring the gameplay experience. An example of this is sprite flickering, which occurred when the NES tried to display more than 8 sprites per horizontal line. This effect is nostalgic for some, but we felt it was detrimental, so we nixed it. However, we did make gameplay design decisions based on the idea of sprite flickering. We tried to avoid cluttering the screen with on-screen objects and limited things like particle effects. Being aware of the rules in this case led to the game feeling clear and simple, one of the hallmarks of a great NES game. The team also extended the viewable screen space to a 16:9 resolution in order to eliminate the black bars on a widescreen. However, David explained they didn't change the resolution in terms of making Shovel Knight a pixel-dense HD game. They kept the same vertical and tile size dimensions, and the extra horizontal space was used to optimize the level design for puzzles, more objects, and to give the player more breathing room. Shovel Knight also has lots of background parallax scrolling, and for those that don't know, parallax scrolling is the ability to shift different layers or parts of the screen at different rates, giving 2D layers the appearance of 3D movement. That effect was only possible on the NES with lots of trickery, and was much more common on the SNES. Early on with Shovel Knight, the studio decided to amp up the parallax scrolling, creating an average of 5 to 6 layers of backgrounds to scroll by. They were able to more easily implement this effect with their own custom C++ engine that supports 3D, and uses DirectX on PC and OpenGL on Mac and Linux. As mentioned earlier, the developers wanted to stick to the NES color palette as much as possible, meaning they only had access to 54 colors in total. In the end, they only added a few extra colors and mostly stuck to the original color palette, giving Shovel Knight a very distinctive look. Sprites on the NES were limited to 4 colors, or 3 colors plus transparency, but games like the Mega Man series used a trick that involved splitting up sprites into 2 separate ones. This allowed sprites to have 4 to 5 colors in addition to transparency, and therefore the team decided to treat Shovel Knight sprites like Mega Man. Getting that balance right was a tricky process according to David. A character with too many colors would stick out like a sore thumb, so they had to work back and forth with detail levels and colors until they found a combo that looked great. The studio used a pixel art tool called ProMotion to create all the sprites and animations, and for their level editor they used a free tool called Tiled. Another example of how the devs broke the NES limitations is implementing a more advanced camera shake effect. The NES was only able to execute a camera shake on a single axis, because of the console's difficulties doing diagonal scrolling. Shovel Knight obviously didn't have this problem, so the team was able to create a better looking camera shake effect. The soundtrack was created by composer Jay Kaufman, and in order to simulate the audio of the NES, he used a free tool called FamiTracker. The tool is able to export music in NES machine code, which is capable of running on an actual NES or Famicom console, with all of its limitations and hardware quirks. Afterwards, he finalized the sounds using mastering tools like EQ and compression to give it some extra punch on today's sound equipment, but avoided using reverb effects or stereo mixing, which would destroy the raw character of the sounds. Any echoes or special effects are programmed note by note, the way they were on the NES. David and the rest of the team were very pleased with the final look and feel of Shovel Knight and how it retained that classic NES style. When you add up all the changes, it seems like there is a vast gulf between Shovel Knight and the technology of the NES. However, we feel that the core of the aesthetics of the 8-bit era has been respected, and perhaps even enhanced. Shovel Knight was a dream project, allowing us to explore a style of game that's rarely seen today. It was fascinating to try and problem solve the technical issues of yesteryear, while avoiding any pitfalls that would belie real modernity. We hope that by being true to the NES in more than just superficial ways, we've built fanciful rock-solid fundamentals. While the game was scheduled to release early 2014, the team had to further delay it to June 2014. During those last few months of development, Yacht Club was in some serious financial trouble. The Kickstarter campaign brought in much more money than they ever thought possible, but when they ran the numbers on developing the base game and the additional stretch goals, Shovel Knight needed a much bigger budget. The developers started cutting costs wherever possible, but the delays also meant they had to stretch their budget for a longer time period, something they hadn't foreseen. We ended up operating for 5 months without money or payments to the team here. It was a difficult period, where some of us were awkwardly standing in front of cashiers having our credit cards declined, drawing from any possible savings, and borrowing money from our friends and family. Luckily, once Shovel Knight was released on June 26, 2014, it became a huge success for the small studio. Reviewers and gamers around the world had nothing but positive things to say about every aspect of the NES-inspired game. Additionally, Shovel Knight even took home the Best Independent Game Award at the Game Awards show in 2014. Besides critical acclaim, the platformer also exceeded the team's sales expectations, and after only a month, Shovel Knight had sold around 180,000 copies. By September 2019, that number increased to 2.65 million copies sold on all available platforms. All this success meant the studio was able to continue development on Shovel Knight without having to worry too much about their budget. The DLC featured 3 additional single-player campaigns, and each campaign allowed the player to take control of one of the boss knights, which drastically changed the gameplay compared to the original Shovel Knight experience. Each campaign was released as a free update, among other free content that was part of the original Kickstarter stretch goals. The PS4 and Xbox versions even received exclusive content, with the former featuring a boss fight with Kratos from God of War, and the latter a boss fight with the Battletoads. In 2017, the original campaign was renamed to Shovel of Hope, and this was partially done to communicate to players that the additional DLC weren't just character swaps, but rather completely new games with their own kind of gameplay and levels. The title was later even changed from Shovel Knight to Shovel Knight Treasure Trove, and this version included every piece of DLC. All previous owners of the original game were able to upgrade to the Treasure Trove edition for free. For the sake of not making this video too long, I'm not going to expand on the game design decisions of the DLC, but I do want to touch on another difficult period in Yacht Club Games history, which took place during the development of the DLC. Plague of Shadows, the first additional campaign, which was originally going to be nothing more than a character swap, had turned into something that resembled more of a sequel than anything else. Of course, by doing this, the team gave themselves a lot of extra work and overtime, and by the end of 2015, after the release of Plague of Shadows, the team was burned out. Unfortunately, the studio couldn't take much of a break since they still had some Kickstarter promises to keep. However, they did make a promise to themselves to never get so close to the breaking point again, and avoid periods of crunch in the future. So, in 2016, the studio made a plan to finish the next 2 campaigns in a more efficient way, and by now the team had also grown from 5 to around a dozen developers. While Spectre of Torment came out without too much trouble, the third and final campaign, King of Cards, kept increasing in scope. To avoid burning out again, the decision was made to delay the release of the King Knight campaign, and this time they didn't have to worry about stretching their budget, since it was now practically unlimited thanks to the sales of Shovel Knight. By December 2019, all the Kickstarter promises were fulfilled, and every backer and owner of the original Shovel Knight was able to claim every piece of DLC for free. To say the developers were relieved after that is putting it lightly. Looking back, the studio, despite the struggles, feels very blessed to have been able to go on this development journey and create one of the most beloved indie games in the past decade. I feel lucky, just really lucky to have been able to work on a game for 6 years. There have been real rough spots, but overall, we got to do so much cool stuff. We got to fly to Japan and go to Nintendo and talk to them. We got to have an amiibo. We got to have Manami Matsume make these songs. We got to meet all our favorite game developers and go to shows. The game's been a success. It's been amazing. We've been real lucky.